We're here today to hunt vampires. Not many years ago, I'd have considered that something somewhat distasteful. We have something in common, our affection for black and nodding acquaintance with the Prince of Darkness, though some might suggest that recent sparkly developments in the genre mean it's open season again. Of course, the first thing we need to do if we want to hunt vampires is to identify what we're after. Now, a quick plug here for one of my recent literary atrocities, Vampire Lovers. It's a book about vampires on the screen, TV and film. If we consult this authoritative tome, and we read the first sentence, it says, "Vampirism is all about sex." That is, of course, nonsense. But not total nonsense. More accurately, vampirism has become about sex. So if we travel back through time to try and identify the origin of the species, if you like, then we'll discover a creature very different to the one we're familiar with in Hammer films or indeed Twilight. It comes as quite a surprise to people if you identify the true homeland of the undead, because it's rather closer to home than you might imagine. The authentic history of vampirism begins in England, and to a certain extent Wales as well, oddly enough. The first vampires recorded are in the 12th century, when there appears to be something of a plague of vampires. All the major chroniclers of the era talk about them at varying levels of length. So we've got William of Newburgh, William of Malmesbury, Walter Map. And these are guys who aren't the sort of Sunday Sport or even Fortean Times writers of their day. If you're a historian wanting to look into history in the 1100s, these are the guys you go to. So the same guys who are telling us when battles happen, when kings are crowned and die and so forth, are also insisting that corpses are running amok in the villages across England. Indeed, I think it's Newburgh who actually at one point says, not only is it a fact that corpses are running amok, but there are so many of these stories that if I tried to actually put them all down, it would eventually become boring. So what are these creatures that are running around in the villages? Well, the first thing is, people may later, and we're going to do a Q&A later on, so you can sort of challenge what I've said and call me mad or whatever seems appropriate. But let's set some ground rules here, because people often say, one of the things you'll read is that the veracity of the vampire myth is underlined by the fact you find them in every culture and every time, and that's frankly bullshit. Only bullshit if you accept my three rules. And the three rules are, first of all, the vampire is a revenant, i.e. someone who's died and come back. So no psychic vampires, no somebody who might have drunk blood at some point. These aren't vampires. They may be vampire-like, but they're not vampires. Second thing, of course, is they drink blood to sustain them in some shape or form. And the third point, which is often overlooked, but I think is crucial and will help us get at the core of the issue, is contagion. Vampirism is contagious. It's almost as if the idea of death is a contagious condition. And you're probably familiar with anyone who likes macabre art with huge numbers of these kind of woodcuts of death assaulting various people. And the meaning of this is manifold and well beyond the remit we have at the moment. But one of the interesting things is they often have bows. And the symbolic idea of a bow as a transferal of disease is a leading metaphor. And if what our friends, the two Williams and Walter, are saying is true, then some of these pictures might not just be symbolic. They might actually be depicting what's going on. One of the fun theories about why vampirism arose to such an extent in this period, then disappeared and appeared to arise again, is a theory that disease itself can mutate. I mean, my knowledge of this area of biology is far too primitive to be able to give an authoritative view on whether this is valid or not. But it's certainly true that this guy had various letters under his name, after his name, which suggested he might know what he was talking about. And he said that the possibility is that there was a disease that caused people to effectively appear to die, would then arise and have some kind of rabies-style ferocity and thirst for blood. I don't know. Why are we getting vampires in the 1100s in England? Before we go any further, another thing worth pointing out at this point is these vampires aren't typically counts or aristocrats, and certainly for obvious reasons not in dinner jackets. They come from every area of the social spectrum. The one unifying factor is they tend to be either excommunicated or even, and dare whisper it in that era, atheists. So, for example, there's one who was a bishop who became notorious for being more enthusiastic about hunting with hounds than delivering sermons. So he returned from the grave. And another, was he a Welshman? I think he might have, who was notorious for drinking and womanizing, and he also returned from the grave. What happens when one of these characters has been identified is that typically disease will start to spread within the community. And folks will get together and agree it'd be a good idea to dig up the last person who was a bit of a bad boy and is in the graveyard. If they dug him up, and if they found him in a certain condition, now that condition is one of the descriptions that crops up again and again is like a drum, i.e. that person is, the flesh is ruddy, but also very taut. So what they're describing is like not the sort of pale and interesting, figure from Gothic cinema. They stink, so again, not very seductive. And the nails grow, sometimes the hair grows, and there's often blood around the mouth, suggesting that indeed they've been consuming the blood of their various victims. Why are we getting these characters in such numbers at this period in history? My own theory on this is we're talking about the start of the Angevin Empire, the Plantagenet dynasty, who are a remarkable medieval dynasty. And there's an interesting story. Henry II was the first of this dynasty. And the Counts of Anjou, there's a wonderful legend which suggests that going back into the dim mists of the past, the originator of the dynasty was looking for a wife, and he was riding about his territory, and he came across a very beautiful maiden, and she definitely fit the bill. So back to the castle, married her, lots of kids, all going very well. Some of his courtiers, however, are suspicious, not least some odd behaviour, the worst of which, in pious eyes, is that she refuses to go to Mass, or if she does go to any kind of religious celebration, slips out before any of the seriously holy stuff happens. So a couple of his knights decide that this time they're not going to allow this. The lady in question, incidentally, is called Melusine, and Melusine crops up in all sorts of medieval myths, clearly a figure based on something or other. Anyway, Melusine is in there, they're about to say Mass, and two of the burly knights stand on her skirt so she can't make an exit. At which point she shrieks with rage, grows some wings, picks up two of her children, and flies out of the window. Obviously, this causes some consternation, and further investigation reveals that Melusine is indeed Satan's daughter. The end result of this, and the reason we're taking this meandering route back to vampires, is, of course, this means that the Angevin dynasty is directly descended from the devil. And this was a legend which actually the Angevin kings themselves sometimes made light of. Richard I, Richard the Lionheart, for example, was obviously a son of Henry II. And he occasionally used to joke about the reason why we're such mean sons of bitches is we come from hell. So one suggestion might be that the reason why we have so many vampires in England at this particular period is because we have a kingdom that's literally ruled by a demonic dynasty, sometimes the Angevin crown, sometimes called the Devil's Crown, and the whole nation is excommunicated on a number of occasions. So if, for example, you suppose that excommunication creates vampires, if you excommunicate an entire country, then I suppose you might well get a plague. Anyway, let's spool forward in history a little bit. One of the interesting things about the vampire plague, if I can continue to call it that, is it sort of sweeps eastward across the map of Europe, if you can imagine that. So we then get accounts in France. Moving forward to the 1500s, we get some very interesting accounts from Germany. We'll pause here briefly, just because these are particularly bizarre, and I suppose might bring us to the rather borderline of what we'd refer to as our vampires. You have a species here which are known as, and I apologise for doing terrible violence to the various languages, but a Naxzeher, which I understand translates roughly as parasite or scavenger. On this particular occasion, what you've got is people are complaining about a strange noise coming from graveyards at the same time as plagues are spreading. This time when we dig up our recently departed ne'er-do-well, he appears to either be chewing and consuming his entire shroud, or possibly part of his own flesh. And the noise people have been hearing is him chewing, and so these are sometimes known as the chewing dead. So obviously they're not actually vampirizing anyone, which brings us, again, as I mentioned earlier, somewhat to the borderlines of what we'd call a proper vampire. But thereafter, all of the major accounts clearly believe that these belonged in the same category as our classic vampire. And I should probably say at this point, the name vampire is not being bandied about yet. In the medieval English accounts, they're cadaver sanguine sugus. That's almost certainly a terrible pronunciation of that, but it doesn't come up in day-to-day conversation very often. But it basically means blood-drinking corpse. We then move forward